Mr. Bacco, I need you to brace yourself. The luxury hospital suite was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioner. The usual sterile scent of bleach and citrus lingered, but it did nothing to dull the sting of what was just said. Damilola Bacco, one of Nigeria's most powerful oil magnates, sat upright on the bed as if sheer posture could shield him from the news crashing into his world. The doctor continued, his voice solemn. You have an advanced form of hepatic sarcoma. It's rare, aggressive. I'm afraid you have approximately 6 months. Damilola blinked slowly, as if his mind was still trying to catch up. What are you saying? He asked, voice hoarse. I've never been sick a day in my life. I had a full checkup last quarter. Are you telling me I'm dying? Dr. Lady took a step forward, expression unreadable. We rechecked everything. The tumor is growing at a rapid rate. It's inoperable. The best we can do now is manage the symptoms. Damilola scoffed, a sharp, bitter sound that didn't match the pain in his eyes. You doctors love that word, manage. Like I'm some worn-out machine waiting for the scrapyard. He stood up, slowly, stubbornly, like a man who still believed standing tall meant something. His reflection in the mirror across the room stared back, a broad-chested, graying figure in a designer robe. He didn't look like a man sentenced to death. At 61, Damilola Bacco had climbed his way out of poverty with bloodied knuckles and sheer will. He built an empire from a single filling station. Today, his name opened doors in Dubai, Geneva, and New York. He had wealth that could buy silence, obedience, loyalty, but not time. He had no wife, no children, not even a godson to pass the crown to. All he had were lawyers, board members, and vultures dressed in designer suits waiting to feast on his legacy the moment he closed his eyes. I'm not done yet, he said, pacing. I haven't secured anything. When I'm gone, everything I built will be torn apart by strangers. Dr. Ladi hesitated. Perhaps this is the moment to consider your personal peace, to find closure. Closure? Damilola's eyes narrowed, voice rising. Closure means there was something whole to begin with. I gave everything to this empire, every second, every breath. And for what? To vanish without a trace? His voice cracked. His breathing grew shallow. The fight, for the first time in decades, didn't feel like his to win. He looked out the window at the skyline he once owned, and for the first time, it looked distant, unfamiliar, as if the city itself had already started to move on without him. Sir, dinner is ready. Loretta stood quietly by the doorway, her hands nervously clasped in front of her as she watched the man she had worked for over the last 12 years sit motionless in the shadows of his study. The warm aroma of egusi soup drifted faintly from the kitchen, but there was no warmth in the room, just a heavy silence that had settled like dust ever since he returned from the hospital 2 days ago. Damilola Bacco, Nigeria's beloved business mogul, known for his infectious charisma and sharp discipline, had become a shadow of himself. Usually he filled every room with ease. His laughter could light up a room, and his glare could silence the boldest voice. He was generous but guarded, approachable but firm. You always knew where you stood with him. But now, he didn't even glance her way. His fingers tapped absently on the armrest, his eyes fixed on some invisible point across the room. He looked like a man staring at the edge of a cliff, too exhausted to pull back. Loretta stepped in cautiously. Sir, is everything all right? It was only then he blinked, slowly turning to look at her. The dim light revealed the pale tone of his skin and the weary slump of his shoulders. But what shook her most was the emptiness in his eyes. They were usually alive, sharp, aware, observant. Now, they looked lost. Do I look all right, Loretta? He asked, voice rough and quiet, barely holding itself together. She swallowed hard. You've been quiet since you came back. I thought, maybe something happened. He let out a hollow breath and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice cracked as he spoke. I went to the hospital for a checkup. Nothing serious, or so I thought. Then the doctor said it. He looked up at her, voice dropping to a whisper. They told me I have an advanced form of hepatic sarcoma. It's rare, aggressive. I'm afraid I have approximately 6 months. Loretta gasped, her hand flying to her chest. No, sir, no, I'm so sorry. He gave a bitter smile, more out of exhaustion than emotion. So am I. Yeah, he said, almost as if mocking the word. The great Damilola Bacco, dying quietly like an old man in a forgotten corner. No, sir. No, that can't be true. Her voice trembled. He looked at her, really looked. And there was something terrifying about seeing fear in the eyes of a man she had always thought invincible. I've spent my life building this empire. I made sure everyone around me had enough. Staff never went unpaid. Families I've never even met benefited from my foundation. But all of it. He paused, his voice hollow. None of it matters if there's no one to carry my name forward. No children. No wife. I was always too busy building to stop and build that. And now that I finally have everything, I have no one to leave it to. There was silence for a few seconds before Loretta stepped closer, her voice trembling but sincere. If there's anything you'd want me to do, anything at all, just let me know. I mean it. Damilola didn't respond right away. He stared at her for a long time, as if searching her face for something. Then suddenly, it hit him, like a flash of light cutting through fog. His posture straightened slightly, his eyes sharpened. An idea, bold, strange, uninvited, entered his mind and refused to leave. There might be something, he said slowly, carefully. Loretta tilted her head. Of course, sir. What is it? He hesitated for a moment, almost unsure if he should say it. But time was slipping away from him faster than he could grasp it. His voice dropped again, low and uncertain. I need a favor, Loretta. One I never imagined I'd have to ask anyone. Her brows furrowed, heart pounding. Yes, sir? He looked her dead in the eyes. I need someone to carry my name, someone to continue my legacy when I'm gone. He paused, then added quietly, I want you to give me a child. Loretta froze, her lips parted, but no words came out. The silence in the room grew thick and heavy. What? Did you say? She whispered. I know, he said quickly, his hands raised slightly as if trying to soften the blow of his own request. It sounds unbelievable, but I've thought it through. You've been by my side for 12 years. You've been loyal, honest, and never once crossed the line. I trust you, Loretta, and I don't trust easily. Her eyes searched his face, trying to find the man she thought she knew under this vulnerable shell. This wasn't a man asking for romance. This was a man reaching out from the edge of the end, searching for a final connection to something that could outlive him. I don't want to die with everything I've built turning to dust, he said, voice breaking. Please, just consider it. Loretta's chest rose and fell unevenly. Her throat tightened as she looked at him. This powerful man, stripped of all his usual certainty, asking her for something she could barely comprehend. Sir, she finally whispered, her voice barely carrying across the room. I've never been with a man before. Damilola's brows drew together in surprise. You're a... She nodded, her fingers twisting into each other, her hands trembling. I'm a virgin, she said, forcing the words out. I've never, not with anyone, ever. The weight of her confession hung between them like a sudden thunderclap. Damilola leaned back slightly, blinking as though he hadn't heard her right the first time. For a man so composed, it was rare to see him caught off guard. But in that moment, all the boldness drained from his face. I didn't know, he murmured, visibly shaken. His tone shifted instantly, softer now, laced with guilt. "Loretta, I didn't mean to put you in such a position. She raised a hand, asking silently for space to think, to breathe, but he wasn't done. "Please, just listen," he said, voice cracking. "I know this is asking too much. I know this isn't fair to you. But if you say yes, I swear, on everything I own, you and the child will never want for anything. I'm not asking for your love. I'm only asking for a future, a name, a continuation of everything I've built." Loretta's heart raced. The room felt like it was closing in. She had grown up in a deeply conservative home, where purity wasn't just a virtue, it was sacred. The idea of giving herself to anyone, let alone like this, it felt like betraying every principle she had carried her whole life. "I don't know if I can," she whispered, her voice fragile. And then, something in Damilola shifted. The fire in his eyes dimmed, his shoulders slumped. For the first time since making the request, he looked away, not out of anger or frustration, but shame. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have asked you that." He never brought it up again. From that moment on, something changed between them. Whenever Loretta entered the room, his eyes would flicker toward her, but never linger. He no longer held her gaze the way he used to. His usual presence, commanding, unshakable, now held a subtle heaviness, as if her truth had humbled him in a way nothing else ever had. Loretta, too, felt the shift. She avoided looking directly at him. She busied herself more than necessary, polishing surfaces that didn't need polishing, double-checking locked doors, folding and refolding already neat linen. But no matter how hard she tried to distract herself, his request haunted her. The days that followed were quiet, but not peaceful. The mansion no longer felt like the controlled, structured space it used to be. Now it was filled with unspoken words and glances that lingered too long before turning away. Damilola Bako, once the bold, composed figure who commanded his world effortlessly, was restless. He would sit by the large window in the study, fingers drumming absently on the armrest, his thoughts clearly miles away. But often, those thoughts would drift to her, to Loretta. He hadn't meant to put her in such an uncomfortable place. He regretted it more with each passing day. Her confession, the fragile truth of her innocence, replayed in his mind constantly. He couldn't forget the look in her eyes, vulnerable, betrayed, confused, and every time she passed him now, carefully avoiding eye contact, his heart clenched a little more. He wanted to say something, anything. But what did you say to someone you had unknowingly wounded? So instead, he acted. He began to notice the little things about her, the way she tied her hair up when she was scrubbing, the silent exhaustion in her steps at the end of each day. For the first time in 12 years, Damilola saw Loretta beyond her role. She wasn't just his housekeeper. She was a woman, a quiet, disciplined woman who had given more than her share to keep his house in order. One morning, she came into the kitchen to find a brand new pair of orthopedic shoes in her size, with a handwritten note. "For the long hours you spend on your feet, DB." The next day, he told the driver to take her off duty early. "Let her rest," he said casually, but the concern in his voice betrayed him. Soon, she began to notice a pattern. The pantry was now stocked with her favorite biscuits, the ones she thought no one noticed she liked. The radio in the kitchen, once broken and ignored for months, had suddenly been replaced. Her laundry was returned from the dry cleaner before she even asked for it. Small gestures, quiet kindnesses, but intentional. Loretta didn't know how to respond. She began to wonder if this was just a guilt-ridden apology or something else. Was he trying to make her feel cared for, or was it still about the child? Was this softness just a new way of asking what his mouth no longer dared to repeat? The thought gnawed at her. One afternoon, after folding the laundry for the guest wing, she stood alone in the hallway, staring at the untouched bouquet of fresh flowers he had instructed to be placed in her room. Yellow roses, her favorite. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch the petals. It was beautiful, too beautiful. And yet, her heart was torn. Why was he doing this? Was it kindness? Was it remorse? Or was it just a tactic? She wasn't sure. And that uncertainty scared her more than the question itself, because for the first time since he'd made the request, part of her had stopped avoiding him. Part of her had started noticing him, how tired he looked lately, how his laugh barely escaped anymore, how guilt had dulled the proud shine in his eyes. She didn't know if he still hoped she'd change her mind, but what unsettled her the most was that a tiny voice inside her was beginning to wonder, what if she did? Loretta stood by the kitchen window that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the tiled floor. In her hands, a dishcloth she had been folding over and over again without realizing it. Her mind wasn't on the chores. It hadn't been for days. Her eyes drifted to the hallway, the one that led to his study, then quickly back to the sink, as if she had caught herself doing something wrong. She couldn't stop thinking about him. Damilola Bako, the man who once seemed so unreachable, so sharply defined by wealth, power, and control, had somehow become something more human. Fragile, wounded, desperate for something no amount of money could buy. And the way he had been treating her lately. No demands, no pressure, just kindness. Thoughtful, quiet kindness. She found herself recalling moments she had buried, moments she had tried not to attach emotions to. Like the night she got the call that her mother's condition had worsened. The cancer had spread faster than expected. They couldn't keep up with the bills. Loretta had been trembling, unable to breathe, not even knowing where to start. She hadn't asked him for help, but somehow, he found out. He called her into his study the next morning, and without a single question or speech, handed her an envelope. Inside was a check, not just for the outstanding hospital bills, but enough to give her mother the best care money could buy. Private doctors, palliative specialists, a peaceful room of her own, no more government waiting lines. Loretta had fallen to her knees that day, sobbing uncontrollably. He didn't hug her. He wasn't that kind of man, but he stood close enough to let her know he cared. And that was enough. Her mother still died 3 months later. But it had been peaceful, dignified. She'd passed in her sleep, holding Loretta's hand, whispering blessings through the pain. That gift, those final days of comfort, had come from him. Now here she was, questioning the intentions of a man who had never once taken advantage of her. Not even when he easily could have. Maybe he did deserve happiness. Maybe he wasn't trying to manipulate her. Maybe this was just a broken man, afraid of being forgotten, asking the only person he truly trusted to help him leave something behind. Loretta wiped a tear quickly from her cheek, her chest tight. She hadn't said yes. She still didn't know if she ever could. But for the first time, her heart ached, not from pressure, but from compassion, and buried deep in the ache was something else. Guilt. Because now, when she walked past him and felt his eyes lift toward her, she didn't just avoid them out of awkwardness. She avoided them because she didn't want him to see what was starting to grow in her own. Pity, and something dangerously close to care, was a quiet evening, the kind that wrapped the house in a soft golden hush as the setting sun filtered through the grand living room windows. The light stretched long across the marble floors, warm and calm, but inside, Loretta's heart was anything but. She paused at the entrance of the room, her breath catching when she saw him, Damilola Bako, seated alone in the shadows. The vibrant man who once ruled boardrooms with a stare was now a shell of himself, his head bowed low into his palms. He looked empty, not like the man she'd served for 12 long years. This version of him looked like he had finally surrendered. "Sir?" she said softly, hesitant. He raised his head slowly. The moment their eyes met, she was struck. His face bore no mask of strength, no trace of the forceful figure the world knew. Just deep exhaustion, physical, emotional, spiritual. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, raw. "I never meant to make you feel uncomfortable, Loretta. I don't know what else to do anymore." Something tugged at her chest. Pain, pity, an ache she couldn't shake. She had watched him rise, dominate, silence entire rooms with a single phrase. Now he was just a man, frail, terminally ill, and utterly alone. She took a step forward. Her voice trembled. "If I agree, if I say yes, what happens after that?" Damilola straightened, a flicker of life returning to his weary eyes. "Then I make everything right," he said, a quiet resolve in his tone. "I'll have the documents prepared immediately. Legal protection, financial security, the house, the assets, my legacy, it will all be yours and the child's. You won't have to worry again. Ever." Loretta's fingers tightened around the hem of her gown. She had never envisioned herself as a mother, certainly not under such conditions. But standing there, looking at the man who once terrified Lagos with his ambition now stripped of every weapon but honesty, she saw the depth of his despair. She inhaled sharply, her heart pounding. "I'll do it," she whispered. Damilola blinked. You will?" She gave a slow, hesitant nod. "Yes, I'll have your child." For the first time in weeks, a smile crept across his face. Not triumphant, not smug, just relief. Deep, quiet, almost childlike relief. But as she turned away to retreat to her room, something heavy settled in Loretta's chest. Had she just made the most irreversible decision of her life? That night, she lay on her narrow bed staring up at the ceiling, her mind racing in 1,000 directions. She had said the words. She had agreed. But now, as silence wrapped around her, doubt began to whisper. Fear gnawed at her. Questions crowded her thoughts. Am I strong enough for this? What will people say? What if I regret this forever? And yet, beneath the confusion was another voice, one that tried to soothe her. It's just a process, a clinical arrangement, no romance, no emotion. People do this every day under sterile lights in hospitals. You'll survive this too. The next morning, with her heart thudding against her ribs, she stood outside his study door. Her knuckles hovered over the polished wood, and then she knocked, gently, but with purpose. "Come in," his voice called, calm, but with that weight of expectancy she could feel through the door. Loretta stepped inside, quietly closing it behind her. Her palms were damp. She wrung her fingers together as her eyes met his. Damilola sat behind his desk, a fresh white shirt hugging his frame. He looked better, less drained, more composed. For a moment, she almost forgot he was dying. "I've been thinking about everything," she said, her voice steady, but her heart thundering. "Since I agreed, I think we should consider artificial insemination. It's safe, private. It doesn't have to be, intimate." He leaned back slowly in his chair, arms folding across his chest. There was a long pause, long enough for Loretta to wonder if she had offended him. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Loretta, I need to be honest with you." She frowned, uncertain. "What do you mean?" He looked down for a moment, then back up, emotion thick in his gaze. "I don't want this to be clinical, cold, something handled behind a curtain by strangers in gloves. I don't want to read about the moment my child was conceived on a report. I want to feel it." Loretta's breath caught. "You're saying you want us to—" "Yes," he said, cutting in gently. "I know it's asking a lot. But if this child is going to be the last thing I leave behind, I want to be present in the beginning. I want that moment to mean something. To me, at least. She took a step back, heart thudding. But I told you, I'm a virgin. That isn't something I take lightly. It's not just a moment for me. He nodded, the muscles in his jaw tightening with emotion. I know, and I would never disrespect that. But Loretta, if you do this, if you give me a child, I swear neither you nor the child will ever suffer. I will give you everything: comfort, security, legacy. Her hands trembled. Everything inside her screamed to walk away, to protect what little innocence she had left. And yet, when she looked into his eyes, she didn't see power or persuasion. She saw fear, hope, a man clinging to one last chance to leave something meaningful behind. Still, she said nothing. She turned, walked out of the room, and closed the door behind her without another word. Because how do you respond to something like that? How do you weigh your own values against someone else's final wish? What if she said no? Would she regret it for the rest of her life? And if she said yes, what would that decision cost her? Was Damilola truly asking out of longing for connection? Or was he afraid of being forgotten? Would he see her as more than just the vessel for his legacy? And most of all, could she ever see him as more than just her employer? The questions are only beginning. If you're still watching this video, you're probably just as torn as Loretta. So what do you think? Should she do it? Or walk away? Don't forget to subscribe for the next part. You won't want to miss what happens next.